We now turn to the life of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's life was not all that interesting. He had a pretty boring life. As a matter of fact, the philosopher, or there was a historian of philosophy named Friedrich Coplestone. He wrote a series of books about the history of philosophy. And Friedrich Coplestone said of Kant, he said, his life was singularly devoid of anything interesting. I love that quote because Coplestone says that. I love that quote because it's sort of like saying, my friend's not just boring. His life is singularly devoid of anything interesting. I mean, what a way to just say, this guy is boring, right? Watching paint dry would be more interesting than hearing a story about this guy's life, I suppose. Anyway, so get ready to watch some paint dry. I'm going to talk about Kant's life. Anyway, but the case is that as far as his life goes, he was born into a large family. He was one of like 11 children, which I would consider large. His family was very religious, and he was born in what's now Russia, city of Königsberg, which I believe is on the Black Sea, although I'd have to look that back up. It was actually a port city. And he went to school at a pietist. Pietists were kind of these very religious people who you might know, like people who women always wear dresses and maybe grow their hair long, and men always wear certain clothes, or Amish maybe would be examples of pietists. And they try to live a certain lifestyle to show their religiosity and honor towards God and being pious. So he goes to a pietist school. He eventually gets through. He becomes he goes to the University of Königsberg. He becomes a professor, and he ends up being a professor and living there his whole life. As a matter of fact, they say that he never actually left Königsberg, not even for the night. Like, he never left the town in his entire career, or entire life. And he lived to be 79. He died of dementia, and he developed dementia and died sometime around, I'd have to look now, but he died, and I think it was 1804. Now that I'm asking, I have to check, because that's just the way that I am. It should be on the page here, but anyway, so he dies. He died in 1804, so February 12th, 1804. So there you go. So anyway, he as far as it goes, that was Bentham's life in a nutshell. And he ends up teaching there his whole entire career. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Kant is he studied, I believe it was physics or theoretical math. He ends up becoming a lecturer in geography and talking about culture and geography, which is kind of funny that he never leaves, but yet he talks about cultures. But he apparently was a very lively lecturer, and people would take his course just because he had all kinds of great stories. Now, he lived in a port city. He would have been considered, part of the educated elite. He would have been very involved with social and political issues, and he would have met many sea captains who would have gone off to India and China, and they would have come back and told him stories and brought objects and other things. And so he would have had a great awareness of the world. And apparently he told great stories about people having gone, and it was very interesting. But yet his writing is very concise, very condensed, and very difficult sometimes to read. And so it's kind of an interesting dichotomy in that he's a science background, a geography professor who writes about philosophy. He's a lively lecturer, but his writing is dense and sometimes very difficult to follow. So he's a man of many dichotomies. Anyway, and so what happens is Bentham ends up, I'm sorry, not Bentham, Kant ends up, that's sort of his life. The other thing about him is he never leaves Königsberg. He stays there his entire career. He stays there his entire life. He never leaves. He's actually, a few other things that are kind of interesting. He's only like 5 feet tall, very short, and he would take a long walk every afternoon, and he would take the same route every single afternoon, and he would do the exact same thing every day, and that was his life, basically. It was said that he was so regular in his walks and his routine that if you saw Kant walking by and it was 8:04 p.m. and he usually walked by at 8:02 p.m., you could assume your clock was wrong rather than Kant. Kant was exact. And so people could set their clocks. Now, they say you could set your clocks. I mean, this would have been time you wind it. Clocks were not maybe as accurate, so you would maybe have to reset them. It's not like now, you just go, oh, Phone resets itself every time it turns on. Computer resets itself. You actually had to set clocks at one time. Anyway, and so that's basically Kant. Now, the thing that I bring up his life and how he never left town or anything that's somewhat interesting is Kant, in today's day and age, most of us consider, in order to be an educated person, in order to be a person who is educated and is a thinker, we would think that somebody needs to be able to have traveled, be culturally diverse, have views and opinions about other worlds, etc. And what Kant ends up saying or doing is Kant ends up saying, you know what, you don't have to go anywhere to do philosophy, to do ethics, to be an educated person. You can do it all right here, because what's right and wrong is not about culture. It's not about what people do. It's not about being diverse and educated and having traveled. It's about being able to understand the inner logic of actions. And if you can understand that, then you can determine if something is right or wrong and then apply it rigidly to everybody. And so that's sort of where Kant's philosophy comes out of. And he doesn't need to travel. It's like saying, you know, today we have a feeling sometimes, you know, like to be an educated person, you would need to travel to England or travel to Europe and do some of this stuff. But I think in his day, for him, you know, it's like doing, you know, water boils pretty much, you know, I mean, it hasn't, I mean, depending on altitude, but, you know, water boils, water, sugar dissolves in water. I mean, those aren't things that change because you're in Asia. These aren't things that change because you're in, Europe. These are things that are true, and you can do experiments here as well as you can anywhere else.